Number 4. Skinwalker Experience. Now, as I preface this, I need to make two things clear. One, I know Skinwalker is an inappropriate term for this, but I hate the word werewolf, and it's the only thing I can think of that suits what I saw somewhat. Two, I was tired at the time, but I hold firm to the conviction that I was awake enough to know what I saw, and to know what I saw was not any type of animal. While on vacation in Arizona a few weeks ago, I was visiting family who live on the edge of a Navajo nation. The town they live in is basically on the border of the reservations and such things. The family in question is my mother's brother and sister, who live together with their spouses in a modest home, but the home is unimportant. I went there during my childhood every now and then, and we had several Navajo friends. So, after a night out catching up with my two old friends, whose names I will not mention because of the events that took place that night, I was driving the two of them home. The female friend, I'll call her Sally, was fast asleep in the right side of the back seat, while the male friend, whom shall be called Frank, was wide awake in the left side of the back seat. As we're on the way to Frank's house, I see something on the side of the road that's briefly illuminated by my headlights. It looks like a large coyote walking down the side of the road on all fours. Frank saw it first and pointed it out to me, so I slowed down and turned my brights on. What we both saw disturbed us so deeply that we had to wake Sally up to see if she would confirm that we were not crazy. When Sally woke up and looked out the window, I had stopped the car at this point, she froze in her place, and the thing, which had been walking along at a leisurely pace until now, turned around and stood up on its hind legs. It did not look like a dog does when it stands on two legs. It looked like it was used to doing it. And before Sally could shake herself out of the soul-crushing fear she was in, Frank and I got a good look at it. It was everything the stereotypical definition of werewolf was, with a few key differences. We saw its snout was less like a wolf's and more like a hybrid between a wolf and a human. Rounded, with a dog's nose slightly protruding out, and sharp teeth. And its hands and feet both had claws on them, which were seemingly permanently extended. That, or it was extremely hostile at the moment it saw us, or rather, her. By the time we were done gawking at the thing, and fear started to take over curiosity, Sally snapped out of her own fear long enough to scream at me to drive as fast as I could. She refused to stop screaming until it was completely out of sight, and when we pulled over, she calmed down enough to regain coherency, and we asked her what was going on. She explained that she could not tell us why, but she knew what that thing was, and that it wanted nothing but to hurt her and anyone related to her. When I dropped her off at her house, I, and Frank as well, felt obligated to walk with her to her door. We asked if she was going to be okay, and she said she would tell her dad. He was back, and he would protect her, like he always did. We just looked at her with concerned looks on our faces, and walked back to the car. On the way to Frank's house, we saw it again, but it was heading in the opposite direction, to Sally's house. We thought it was either another one, or the same one which had gotten lost or visited someone else, and was now going to Sally. Deciding that it was our duty as friends to Sally to try and protect her from whatever this thing was, we turned around, but when we did so, the creature reared up once again and looked at us. Then, something I will never forget happened. It let loose a deep, guttural roar directed at us, a roar so bestial in nature that it shook us both to our cores. Apparently, we were not the only ones that were shaken, as my car's radio died and the engine shut off. I screamed at the top of my lungs, accompanied by Frank, and fumbled to turn it back on. By the time the creature was halfway to our car, it was walking into the road toward us. I got it back on in time to floor it out of there as fast as possible. When I finally slowed down enough to not break every speed limit in America, I realized I had passed Frank's house about 3 miles back. I didn't see the creature again that night, although I drove by Sally's house again and everything seemed fine. No broken windows or signs of forced entry, and I haven't seen anything like it since. I don't know what to call it other than a skinwalker, but whatever it was hostile, and it plagued either the local community or one of my friends specifically. I have kept in touch with both Frank and Sally, and Sally refuses to talk about it, and will only say things are fine when I ask about it. Frank can't get anything out of her either. I'm afraid for her. I'm afraid for everyone in that area. Number 3. My werewolf sighting. This is something that happened to my husband and I a good 9 years ago. We had gone to watch a friend's band play, and were headed home from downtown Dallas. It was around 1 a.m., but we still had plans before I was expected home, since we were still dating at the time. So we headed his apartment in one of the South Dallas suburbs. This is a pretty well-populated suburb, but by the time we got close to his apartment, the roads were pretty much empty. We exited the highway and turned onto the street that led to his apartment. But as soon as we passed the traffic light under the highway, we both saw it, plain as day, stone sober and wide awake. We both saw a mother-effing werewolf-type creature exit a neighborhood street and calmly run in about 4 steps across a 4-lane road. It was about 75 yards in front of us, but it wasn't exactly the way I'd imagine a werewolf. It was completely canine, no human features at all except for the fact that it was on 2 legs. The legs were massive, and the thing was about 7 feet tall, but the arms reminded me of T-Rex arms. They were small and still hung like dog legs. They seemed very useless if the thing were trying to attack something. The head was also odd. Besides being a typical dog color, a grayish-black, the eyes were bright, glowing yellow, even when there weren't headlights shining directly in them. It didn't look like the glow an animal gets from lights in their eyes anyway. But the thing that stood out to me the most were the eyes, that they were biocular like a fish. I saw the eyes clearly, even though he was completely profiled to us. The road we were driving on had heavy trees on the right side of us. When it came out, it was running, but crossed the road in just a few steps. It was big enough and effortlessly fast enough to know that a human couldn't have dressed up and done this. There was an open field that he ran into. When my husband and I got to where the trees broke, we both turned our heads to look, but it was long gone by then, about 4 seconds. I think the only thing that was said then was a quiet, "What the fuck?" by me. Now, more about what this thing looked like. To be honest, it was much less scary than what I would imagine a werewolf to be. When it was running across the road, I didn't get the sense that it cared that we saw it, or that it was even trying hard to cross before we got closer. I didn't feel fear as if we were threatened. Only disbelief, really. And again, it's not like we were in a rural area by any stretch of the imagination. When we passed the tree line, his apartment complex was literally another 150 yards or so up the road. We hurried in and didn't exactly get to our plans. We basically just sat there in silence, trying to rationalize, I guess. Still, to this day, I often think to myself, did this really happen? But as soon as I close my eyes and think about it, those bright yellow eyes are still there. Number 2. Dogman Encounter. I live in the northwestern side of Michigan, and we had this legend called the Dogman. It's basically like a werewolf type thing. You can read about it on Wikipedia for a more extensive explanation. I was 9 years old when this happened. At that point, I still shared a room with my sister, and so my bed was on one wall, with a big window on the opposite side. My sister's bed was right underneath that window. We were on the first floor of the house, but we live on a hill, so it's slanted, and so it's still a pretty high window, about 9 feet off the ground maybe. Anyway, I woke up one Saturday night feeling really thirsty. It was about 2 in the morning, and everyone in my house was asleep. I was about to crawl out of my bed to go to the bathroom just down the hall, when I looked at the window, and froze. At the very bottom of the window, there was a really dark shape. It looked kind of like the top part of a Siberian husky's head. It was a big thing, with 2 points that looked like ears on top. I couldn't make out any other features, so while I was still scared, at first, I just thought it was the reflection of the pillows at the end of my sister's bed. And then, it moved. You know how dogs kind of twitch their ears and perk them up when they're trying to hear better? That's what this shape did. The 2 points that it took for ears twitched and then came back into place, and it wasn't a subtle movement at all, so I knew it wasn't just a reflection. Now, the Dogman story is really big here, and we live right in the woods, so I immediately thought of that. I got really scared then, so I did the typical kid thing and pulled the covers over my head and went back to sleep without getting my water. In the morning, there was nothing outside my window, and no marks on the side of the house or anything. No evidence that there might have been anything there at all. The thing that really stumps me is wondering how anything would manage to stay up by a window that's 9 feet off the ground in the first place. Since I was 9, I do accept that it was possible that I just imagined it. I already knew the Dogman story, so maybe I was just scared to begin with, and that fear kind of manifested itself like that. At the same time, I really do believe that there was something outside the window, Dogman or not. Number 1. Werewolves of Wyoming. This story comes from a friend of mine that I used to share an apartment with. I interpreted it as a werewolf encounter at the time, but have since learned about skinwalkers, and I'm more leaning toward that explanation now. It's a creepy story either way. My roommate, a guy we'll call Jim, spent his high school years in a little town in eastern Wyoming. I can't recall the name of the town, but it was the kind of place that most people have forgotten about since the train had stopped coming through. It was a very weird little town, and most of the people living there seemed to be very paranoid. A lot of parents would not let their children play outside after dark, and all unfamiliar faces were regarded with suspicion. Since the town was miles away from the nearest McDonald's, or movie theater, or shopping mall even, there was nothing for young people to do but get shit-faced drunk. That's what Jim and his friends were planning to do on the night that this story takes place. A fellow classmate was having a kegger at his parents' house that night, which was 20 miles out of town on a dirt road somewhere. Jim had reservations about driving out there in the dark, because that general area was known to be sort of creepy at night. But his friends really wanted to go, and he was the only one with a car. So, after some coaxing, Jim and about 5 of his friends piled into his Buick and headed out of town. About half an hour later, they realize that they're lost. They can't find the road that they're supposed to turn on, and it's too dark to read any of the signs. They haven't seen any houses or cars for a while, so they figure they must have taken a wrong turn somewhere, and decide to head back down to the main road. After turning the car around and driving in the opposite direction for a few miles, Jim spots something in the middle of the road up ahead. His friend in the passenger seat notices it at the same time, and says, "What the fuck is that, dude?" At first, they can't tell what they're looking at, but as the car draws nearer to the big black shape in the middle of the road, it starts to look like a mass of fur. Jim thinks it must be an animal, but it looks big enough to do damage to his car, so he slows down and stops the car about 20 feet away from the thing. At this point, it is completely illuminated by his headlights, but neither he nor his passengers can figure out what the hell kind of animal it might be. Since it hasn't moved, they assume it might be dead, and start to argue over who will drag it over to the side of the road. That's when the thing starts to move. They all fall silent and watch as it stirs, then suddenly stands up. Jim would always preface the next part of the story with, "I know this sounds crazy, but..." And then he says he can't really describe what he saw because he had never seen anything like it before. The closest thing he can come up with is this. The thing, whatever it was about 7 feet tall when it rose to its full height. Its body was shaped like a human male, but it was covered in a thick, dark fur. The head, he said, and I watched the goosebumps break out on his arms as he said it. was not human. It looked almost like a jackal or a German shepherd, with a long snout and pointed ears, and its eyes were glowing in the headlights the way that a cat's eyes sometimes glow. It was staring right at them. Jim doesn't know how long he stared back at the thing before he noticed that it was clutching a dead rabbit in one of its enormous hands or paws. He barely had time to register this bit of information when the creature suddenly flung the dead rabbit away, and it took a step toward the teenagers in the car. Everyone screamed, and Jim slammed the car into reverse, made a U-turn, and got the hell out of there. Needless to say, they didn't make it to the party that night.